Hello everyone and welcome to this BMC Helix webinar. Today we're going to be looking at the deployment process for the Helix Innovation Suite stroke ITSM products, specifically the Jenkins Helix on-prem deployment pipeline that's used to drive the deployment of all of those products. My name is Mark Walters. If you've attended some of these on-prem webinars over the last year or so, you'll probably recognize my face. I've been with BMC for 25 years now, and for the last couple of years or so, I've been specializing in these on-prem deployment processes. The agenda for today will start with the obligatory review of the Helix architecture. That's obviously changed a lot since earlier installer-based, server-based versions. We'll have a look at the deployment prerequisites, the steps that you need to have completed before you can start using Jenkins to actually install and deploy the products. A quick overview of what the deployment pipelines are, how they work, and how they all link together. And then we'll switch over to run in Jenkins, and we'll go through one by one all of the different components, all of the different values that you need to provide when you do an installation, a deployment of Helix Innovation Suite. The current version, 22.106 of Helix ITSM, requires a Kubernetes system. Hopefully this doesn't come as a surprise to anybody here. This has changed from the last non-Kubernetes containerized version, which was 2002. As well as running on Kubernetes, we also have this additional Helix platform, the common services component that we use to provide RSSO and a number of other services that the application depends on. We're working today up at the orange box at the top left-hand side there, the BMC deployment engine, where the Jenkins service runs, the Jenkins server runs, and that provides the GUI, the interface to do the Helix IS implementation. We're not going to go into any more details on the architecture. Hopefully, I say it's something that you've all seen before. There are quite a few hoops that you need to have jumped through and steps that you need to have completed before you start using Jenkins to do an installation. These are the main ones highlighted here. You need to have synchronized all the images from BMC DTR. You can deploy directly from it, but it's not recommended. You need to have installed and configured the Helix platform. You need to have registered all of your IS product host names. Combination of the customer service and environment values that we'll see later need to have been used and registered in DNS, and also you need a SSL certificate that covers all of those, either through a wildcard or through a series of SANs, subject alternate names in the certificate, so that they can all be SSL connected to using an SSL service. The RSSO product that's deployed as part of the Helix platform, you need to have created the realm for the Helix IS URLs and set that up. You need to have restored, in most cases, restored your Innovation Suite database dump, created the namespace for the Helix Innovation Suite, and of course completed the deployment, the preparation and the setup of the deployment engine. So what do we mean by the deployment pipelines? I'm hoping you've all already at least seen what Jenkins looks like. Jenkins is a GUI. We'll switch over and use it directly in a few minutes. But it has a series of pipeline scripts. It's broken down into a set of pipeline scripts that control and deploy the various Helix IS components. There are different types of pipelines. The main one that we'll be working with and looking at in detail is the first one there, the Helix on-prem deployment pipeline, sometimes called the Uber pipeline. And that's where all of your customer-specific and environment-specific values are provided to drive the installation. That in turn calls a series of other product deployment pipelines and configuration pipelines that are shown there that do things such as deploy the mid-tier, the platform pods, smart IT, sets passwords, does the integration of the different components. So all of the heavy lifting that's necessary to deploy and configure all these applications is done by all these other pipelines. In addition, there are a series of maintenance pipelines, post-installation, upgrade, updates that you'll possibly also see in your Jenkins. Some of them aren't there by default. You'll create them as part of the process of getting ready to do an upgrade or a patch application. Again, the documentation will detail how to do all of that. So don't be surprised if you don't see all of these pipelines on a fresh system. Some of them need to be added before they'll actually be used. Quick overview of what the pipelines an attempt to try and explain what the pipelines do at a very, very high level. So as I said, the Helix on-prem deployment pipeline is the main input pipeline. That's where you'll be working, and I think it's probably the only one that you actually build directly. All of the others are called from the on-prem deployment pipeline. The first thing that does is called the Helix generate config pipeline. That takes all of the values that you've provided, puts them into a configuration file that the other pipelines then use to get the values to actually do the installation. The scripts use a combination of command line tools, Linux command line tools such as sed and grep and things, and then Kubernetes specific tools such as kubectl and Helm to actually process all of your input values, build, populate templates, and actually do the deployment. If you're interested, you can go and have a look at the pipeline scripts directly. You can clone them to extract them from the on-prem installer where they're provided from the EPD on the command line on your deployment engine machine, cd to the repo directory where they're installed, do the git clone command as seen there, and then you'll have a bunch of Jenkins files that you can have a look at. They're written in a language called Groovy. If you're interested in coding and you want to sort of get into the nitty-gritty and the details of what the pipelines do, possibly also useful for troubleshooting, and there are a couple of specific use cases where we ask you to modify some of these files, which involves checking them out, modifying them and checking them back in. Right, so we're going to switch over now to actually use Jenkins, and we will go through, hopefully, all of the options, all of the things that you need to provide to do a successful installation. If you've got Jenkins installed, this should be familiar to you. This is the main dashboard at the top of Jenkins. Here are all the pipelines that are currently set up on this system. Don't worry about the status. This is a test box that's been used for various things. They're all in different states. Thing to note, just on the left hand side here are these agents. So the built-in agent, you should have three: the built-in one, and then two others which are named based on the host name of your deployment engine. You can see up here my deployment engine is mwalters K3SDE. Which is the name of one of the agents, and the other one just has the Git prefix. We'll use both of those values actually in the pipeline. So just worth having a note, or at least knowing where to go to find them if you need them. You can build the pipeline in a number of ways. You can click on it and choose the build with parameters option. Almost all the options also have a context sensitive menu that you can use to jump straight in. There are quite a few sections in the pipeline. We'll go through them all in detail where possible, or some of them we'll skip over because they're either not used or that you just use the defaults, but we'll try and explain what they're all used for. So start off with the infrastructure section. So the Helm binary, as I said, this is one of the tools that's actually used to do the package deployment. In fact, it's the main tool. You can specify a different name here. Maybe you've got different versions of Helm on your deployment engine for some reason. If it's used for other purposes, maybe you've got a Helm 3 or Helm 3.11, whatever. The default is almost certainly acceptable unless you've explicitly configured an additional version. Leave that as Helm. The custom binary path, I wouldn't recommend that you select this. It allows for you to put the binaries in a non-standard system, a non-standard directory, sorry. So perhaps you're on a perhaps you're not responsible or you don't own the system where the deployment engine is being run. So you don't have root access to put them in the usual user local bin, for example. This does, if you select this option, it does require some slight other setup. You need to have a profile file that's used that I don't think is very well covered. So I wouldn't recommend, there's no need to use the custom binary path, leave that unselected. The agent is the host name that began with Git that we saw on the dashboard screen. So that's the name of the deployment engine with the Git prefix. The pipelines have been inherited in part from BMC's SAS process. So there's a little bit more complexity in here than, strictly speaking, is necessary maybe for on-prem deployment, because obviously BMC are deploying this stuff at scale and with higher levels of automation than we use for individual customers. So you need to provide the node name of the agent there. The checkout user will almost certainly be GitHub. This is one of the credentials that should already have been set up in Jenkins for you. There's no reason to change that unless you've gone and changed the credential label for some reason, the credential ID. And the same goes for the kubeconfig credential. It should have been added automatically and should have the ID kubeconfig. You may have changed it. Perhaps you're using Jenkins to manage more than one IS deployment and have separate kube configs for each. It's also relevant during disaster recovery. We're not going to go into the details of that, but there are cases where this would be changed. But for a fresh install, which we're focusing on today, this is almost always certainly going to be kube config. The Git user home dir is literally that, the home directory of the user that you're set up the deployment engine as. The default obviously is Git. You can change that as part of the deployment engine setup process, unless there's a good reason to have done so. Keep it as the default. The Git repo dir is the path, an SSH path, to where the Git repository files that you downloaded from BMC are stored. This is my deployment engine system. You can see I'm in the home Git directory, and I've got a Git repo directory, and in there are all of the separate product pipeline directories. So in my case, it's home Git repo, which is the default. It will be, in your case, probably exactly the same. And in here, just put the host name. If you've got them somewhere else, change the path. The important thing is that it's SSH and that the Jenkins user is able to do passwordless access to the system as Git. Again, should all have been set up as part of the deployment engine. If you get errors when you're running the pipeline regarding access to the Git repositories, that's one of the things to check to make sure that the SSH setup is working properly. We're not going to go into the troubleshooting details. We don't have time, I'm afraid, but there are some other webinars available that cover some troubleshooting steps. Customer info section. Is cloud not relevant probably to most customers? It's specific to public cloud. So if you're using something, for example, like AWS, if you enable the is cloud option, it will create some additional load balancers to expose some of the services as part of your platform. The product documentation, the performing the service management installation section, also goes through and now has a very good description of all of these values that we're providing. If you look, for example, at the is cloud here, it talks about AWS and load balancers. It's optional. If you choose not to do this for some reason, you can do it manually later. It's not a requirement that you select this option if you're using a public cloud provider. It's just modifies slightly the way the pipeline works. The root enabled and root TLS are not used. They're internal settings that have been exposed for some reason. There are a few of those we'll see later on, which I'll tell you to ignore. There's no reason for you to select those. We don't support these generally for on-prem use. The OS restricted SCC. So this is an OpenShift feature to do with restricted restricted configurations and namespaces. If you're using an OpenShift cluster and you have SACs enabled on your system, you'll have to check with your cluster admin whether that's the case. They should be able to confirm that. You may need to select this option to get the product to install. It slightly changes the way the pipeline interacts, or some of the things that it does. It modifies that. So if you're using OpenShift and using SCCs, you may need to select that. The pipeline has a number of different deployment modes. Again, we're only worried about the fresh one today. Update and upgrade are used for patches and product upgrades, and service is a special use case for modifying an existing deployment. So for example, if you're changing your database user credentials or host name, you might need to run the pipeline in service mode. There'll be documentation or information from BMC directly on if you need to do that, on how it should be done. For today, we're only interested in fresh. Cluster, so this is the cluster config, the context name for your cluster. So to access the Kubernetes using a command line tool, kubectl for example, to be able to get a list of namespaces, you need to be able to authenticate and work with the Kubernetes API. That's done through a kubeconfig file, which has a configuration and can have more than one configuration. So you can have a kubeconfig file that supports multiple clusters, and the way it differentiates between the different clusters is with a thing called contexts. So if you can use kubectl config, get context from the command line, and it will list the context that you have on your system. In my case, I only have the one, which is K3S. Depending on your environment, you may have multiple. So in here, for me, the cluster name, the context is K3S. Customer name, hopefully self-explanatory. The Innovation Suite namespace you will have created beforehand. In my case, I'm using Helix IS. The customer service and environment, two very important values. You should already know these by the time you get to this stage, because you needed to have these values set or determined before you created the product URLs and your SSL certificate. The documentation has a good explanation here on how it's used, but it's the combination of customer service and environment that determine the host names that access your service. So you should already have got these registered in your DNS, so you need to know what they were before you started. One thing to point out is there's a special use case for using the word prod as the environment. If you use the word prod as the environment, it gets dropped from the URLs. So for example, on my system, I've used Helix ITSM as my customer service and environment, which means my mid-tier URL will be helix-itsm.domain name. If I were to use prod as the environment, it wouldn't be helix-prod.domain, it would just be helix.domain. You drop it from the host names that you need to register, but you don't drop it from the name of the realm that you need to create in RSSO. So that's something that's caught a couple of customers out and you need to be aware of. The ingress class, it is possible to install more than one ingress controller on a Kubernetes cluster. Most customers don't. If you do have multiple ingress controllers, they differentiate themselves by a thing called an ingress class. The default for Ingress Nginx is just Nginx. It probably is that in your environment. Again, check with your cluster admin or have a look at your ingress configuration to confirm whether that's the case. If there's no explicit ingress class set as part of the configuration, then the default of Nginx is in use. The cluster domain is the name of the DNS name of your system. In my case, it's CL3KS.bmc.com. That's used again as part of your cluster domain there. It's used to help configure all your URLs and will have been determined before you started. The input config method. So remember we were talking about earlier the overview of the pipelines. The first pipeline that's usually run is the sub pipeline is the generate config pipeline, which takes all of the values we're providing them here and stores them in a configuration file for the other pipelines to use. It is possible to manually provide that input file, but it is a very large, more than 1,000 lines of parameters that needed to be provided, and it's effectively for on-prem use at the moment, it's too complex. There are simply too many options that you need to set to use it directly. Within BMC's SaaS systems, we have different ways of generating that config file. So we've got support in the pipeline for manual input, but for on-prem use, this is almost always, in fact, it is always going to be generate input file. So you can ignore the input config file because that's only relevant if you're using the manual option, which we're not, so that's not used. The CA certs file, as part of the prerequisites, I said you needed to have created and configured an SSL certificate. You need to download a CA certs file, a Java key store CA certs file from BMC, and add your certificates to that file, and then attach that file to this pipeline. And that part, the CA certs file then gets attached and imported into the various pods that communicate with the outside world, with the external URLs, and need to be able to deal with the SSL certificate that you've used. It's one of the, in fact, I think it's the only parameter that doesn't get inherited if you rebuild the pipeline. So if at any point you decide to rebuild a previous deployment, all of these values will be repopulated from that run, except for the CA certs file. So every time you build the pipeline, you have to remember to reattach the CA certs. If you don't, it will replace the one that's in your cluster with the default, and you'll have troubles accessing the service until you fix it. So remember to attach that, and that file needs to have been downloaded and be available on the machine where you're running the browser. It'll open a file picker window that you can choose and select the file from. If you've provided a non-default password on the CA certs file, you can add it here. Otherwise, you can leave that as it is. DBSSL cert, the pipeline has the beginnings of support for enabling encryption on the connection between the pods and the IS database. It's not yet fully implemented, so this currently isn't used. So leave that blank. Customer size, compact for non-HA test systems, small, medium, and large, depending on the number of concurrent users you're planning. Which option you select determines which template is used for generating the configuration file, and that has information such as the number of replicas of the different pods, plus information about Java heap sizes for individual applications that can change depending on the size. So pick the size that's appropriate depending on the deployment that you're doing. One of the cases where you might rerun the pipeline is actually to change the sizing. So if you've deployed as a small and you determine your environment grows, that you have more users than you anticipated, you can rebuild the pipeline and change the sizing after deployment. The source versions, source version here and the smart reporting source version are not relevant for a fresh install. They're only used during upgrades and updates. And the documentation for that process will tell you how to determine what these should be. So we'll leave those as NA. And the Helm versions, the platform and smart apps Helm versions, these are specific to the version that you're installing. They're baked into the pipeline as defaults, so you can't actually change those during a fresh install. Just leave them as they are. And then the Helm node is the other name, it's the host name of your deployment engine machine. It was the other one that we had in that build agents list on the dashboard screen. The Helm node and the agent are, again, it's a hangover, I think, from the SaaS history of this pipeline. Where we deploy at scale, we have multiple Jenkins servers doing various jobs, and so this allows you to spread the work around across different data centers and different systems, but it's not relevant for on-prem use today because everything's run from the same system. The product selection checkboxes here are for the Smart Apps pipeline. So these are all related to Innovation Suite Smart Apps, the business workflows, digital workplace, multi-cloud service management, for example. So here you select the ones that you want to deploy. Insights, bear in mind, you need to have deployed Insights as part of the Helix platform if you're going to use that. And also be aware there are, excuse me, some dependencies. So if you look in the documentation for this section, it talks about, for example, here, Cloud Actions. You need DWPA as a prereq. For multi-cloud service management, you need BWF. So pick the options that you want, but double check to make sure that you have any dependencies selected. The infra deploy section relates to logging primarily. The first four options, the support assist tool options, are the Helix Innovation Suite logging. So the support assist tool is a separate pair of pods and a web interface that you can use to download the application logs from, for example, the platform pods, the SQL API and filter logs, or the Catalina logs from a mid-tier. The support assistant tool provides the interface, so you recommend you select this. If you select that, you also need the sidecar. So this is a sidecar container that's deployed in the pods alongside the product containers, and this is the sidecar. This is the tool that actually does the collection and packing up of the logs and passes it back to the support assistant tool for you to download. So you need to have those two together, and you also need to create a role and a role binding to give the support assistant tool permissions to access your pods. Unless you want to create them manually, let it support the role and use the name of default. Talk to your Kubernetes admin if you have any concerns about setting this up. They may want you to use a different named account. The documentation has steps to manually create the role and role binding if you want to do that. Otherwise, let the pipeline do it. The Fluent Bit and Fluent Detail log relate to BMC Helix logging as part of the Helix platform. So if you've deployed the Helix logging component, you'll have Elasticsearch and Kibana that you can use to view the standard out pod logs from the Helix platform. You can also send selected lines, selected errors from the AR error log, for example, the AR monitor log, the Catalina out, I think. It varies from pod to pod which logs are monitored and which types of errors are sent, but they can also be sent off to the BMC Helix logging system if you've selected those two, and you get an additional sidecar container as part of the pod. Product deploy section is the main pipeline bit, which controls what's deployed. Generate configs needed to create the config file. Platform deploy does the mid-tier platform pods. One of the earlier slides tried to explain it, and again, it's in the documentation up at the top here of this performing the install page. Talks about individual pipelines and what they actually do if you want a little bit more detail. For some reason, the full stack upgrade option is selected by default. It shouldn't be. Deselect it. It's not obviously it's not used as part of a fresh install. It's only relevant when you're doing an upgrade. Smart reporting is now deprecated in favor of Helix dashboards. However, some customers are still installing it, so obviously you can select the pipeline there. The Helix configure ITSM one sets the HANA admin password. The default out of the box HANA admin password can be reset, and this is the pipeline that does that. And then the interops pipeline does the integration with the Helix platform, creates the cross-launch panels that are part of the Helix portal to allow you to go from one to the other directly without logging in again. Other pipelines here are not relevant during installation. Obviously, they're part of the DR process or the update process. You'll only select those when explicitly told to do so as part of whatever you're doing. Database and other passwords and credentials. The AR admin user and admin password are not used for a fresh install. Those are used during updates when a Remedy API client needs to log into the system to do some work, update some values in forms, for example, and things like that. So those two are blank, are not used during a fresh install. The registry type, although Harbor is listed as an option, and we talk about using Harbor as an example registry server in the docs, and the next parameter is called the Harbor registry host. Don't pick Harbor. The only valid option for on-prem is DTR. The Harbor and the other value are for internal BMC use. So leave that as DTR. The Harbor registry host password and credentials. So you should have already set up an internal registry server and synchronized the BMC product images from the BMC DTR. This is the host name and the credentials to access that system. The DB type, so this is the Innovation Suite database that's external to the cluster, and you should already have set up and restored the database dump. We support Postgres, Oracle, and SQL. Pick the one that you're using. DBSSL and DB JDBC URL, again, are part of the encryption option that I mentioned earlier that's not currently fully implemented. So you're not going to use the SSL enabled. The JDBC URL may have a use case, for example, if you're using an Oracle rack, you need to specify a slightly more complex connect string. But for most customers, I think this will be left as it is. Database port, 1433 for SQL, 5432 default for Postgres. Check with your DB admin what you're using for your system. Oracle service name, if you're using Oracle, it's relevant, and then the DB host name and DB admin and DB admin password. Part of the IS installation process involves restoring a database. If you're using SQL or Oracle, you have to do that manually. You download a DB dump from BMC, and there's a documentation section on what you need to do to restore that. So you create a database and you restore the database dump. You can do the same for Postgres, or you can allow the pipeline to restore the database only for Postgres. If you're letting the pipeline do it, then the database restore option here will be selected, and you need to provide the database admin user and database admin password. That's only necessary to allow the pipeline to do the Postgres database restore. If you've manually restored the database, Postgres, SQL, or Oracle, the database admin user and password aren't used, so it doesn't matter. Database always on, if you're using a SQL cluster or Oracle rack or whatever, tick that as relevant. The logs Elasticsearch hostname. So this relates back to the sidecar fluent bit here, fluent bit and fluent bit detail. If you've selected those, you also need to provide the logs Elasticsearch hostname. The documentation gives you an example. Where's it gone? Logs Elasticsearch hostname. Logs Elasticsearch hostname. So it's the name. It's the service dot namespace name from the Helix platform. So if you've installed BMC Helix logging, you'll have this EFK Elasticsearch data HL service and in your Helix platform namespace. So that's what you include here. Don't select that. The logs Elasticsearch service isn't SSL enabled currently, so that shouldn't be it is selected. Okay, sorry, it is selected. I have to double check that. I didn't think that was currently used, but it appears it is. So for the current version, select that option also. Logs Elasticsearch password is a value that you provided for Kibana in the secrets.txt file as part of the Helix platform installation. These next ones are important: the FTS, Elasticsearch, hostname, port, username, and secure. This is critical for the IS server to be able to work. And again, it's the name of a service and namespace name that's part of the platform. This is the case up to 23.4 of the Helix platform. In version 24.1, which was recently released, the service name has changed. The docs need to be updated. There is another page where it's correctly specified, but we use an OpenSearch service, OpenSearch pod, rather than Open Distro, so that name changes. But it's important that you get the right host name, the right port number, 9200. The password is admin. That's fixed, you can't change that, and you must remember to check the secure option. If that's not checked, it won't work, because we use an SSL connection for the Elasticsearch system for FTS, and it's not configurable. It's enabled and always on by default. You can choose to install different locales. Simply enter the codes here. So this is the platform and ITSM locales. Personally, I'd recommend you don't do it during the fresh install. Come back and do it after the fact by simply importing the D2P packages. And there's a knowledge base article that details how to do that. It can add considerable time to the installation if you do it during install. The image secret name is simply the name of a secret that's created with the credentials for the registry server, so you can choose what to use. The baked user HANA admin password is what the interops pipeline will set the HANA admin password to. ARDB name user password. If you've restored the database, you'll know these. Defaults AR system, AR admin, AR hash admin hash, depending on how you created it. If you're allowing the pipeline to do the Postgres restore, these are the values it will actually create and set. But otherwise, you should already know these because you've done the database restore process. The app service password, these next three, again, you provide them. There is a gotcha here. These two can be up to 20 characters. The AR server app service password is limited to 19. A couple of customers have fallen foul of that, where they've set them all to be longer, and it causes a deployment failure. Smart reporting, if you're using it, just like the ARDB parameters, you can set the database name, user and password. You will have restored the database or allowed the pipeline to do it. Provide the values as appropriate. The virtual chat credentials, even if you're not using the product, you need to provide them. These are mandatory values, so you need to set them, and the two usernames have to be different. If you try and set them to the same, you'll encounter an error, so set them regardless. DWP config, again, if you're using DWP today, you've probably already got a value for this. Maybe you'll be migrating data and have to carry that over. Otherwise, set that. Important thing is to note there's no spaces, and you can set a password for accessing that system. Again, this is not one that you're that's part of the system already. It will actually be set to the value that you provide. You can change the alias, which you'll see as part of the mid-tier URL. It's the server name in the mid-tier URL. So feel free to set that to something more suitable to your local environment. The platform admin external IPs. So this is optional at the install stage. You can manually configure it later, but this allows you to, this exposes an IP address for a service to connect using the Remedy API clients such as the Developer Studio. The important thing to note is that it must have square brackets around it. If you don't put square brackets around it, the generate config pipeline will fail. So please remember to add that, and that's actually mandatory for the upgrade and update pipelines. But as I say, for a fresh install, you can specify it now. Maybe a load balancer that your network admin has set up, or possibly an IP address of one of the nodes in your cluster. Enable platform into normalization. For compact and small deployments, we only deploy platform FTS pods. So this setting isn't relevant because all of the services are running. For medium and large, there are separate platform FTS into user and SR pods. By default, the normalization engine plugin isn't running on the integration pods, which can cause issues if you have clients that are triggering CMDB workflow because the plugin's missing. So that enables you to turn that on. The mid-tier cache builders, leave them as the defaults unless advised otherwise. I'm not quite sure why they're exposed, but you can leave those as they are. And then optional, deploy the BWF content pack. I think that adds half an hour. It takes quite a long time to do, so maybe possibly something you do or don't want to do during a deployment if you're short on time. RSSO parameters. So this is the RSSO URL. Here's, for example, the one that I'm using. It's the LB host from your infra config with the HTTPS bit on the front and RSSO added on the end. So it's the URL that you would use to get to the RSSO login page, the admin login page. RSSO admin user defaults to admin with the password RSSO #admin hash. Unless you've changed it, you need to enter the values though. So regardless of whether you're using the defaults or not, enter them. And then the tenant domain. This is, if you log into RSSO and look at your tenant page, it's not the SaaS tenant, it's this other one here. So this is made up of the company name from the infra config plus a numeric value that's dynamically generated. So you need to specify that in the same format there. It's not just the name, it's the name dot number. Helix platform domain, it's probably the same as your cluster domain, unless you've set them up with different hosts, different domain names for some reason. It's unlikely. So in my case, seal K3S seal K3SBMC.com. The Helix platform namespace, mine is Helix platform. Yours could be whatever you've selected. And then the Helix platform customer name. This is the company name from the infra config. So this will be the first bit of the tenant domain. It's used as part of the platform. The final section that's relevant for on-prem deployments today is this interops section here. So these are used by the interops pipeline, and these are this controls the options that are configured as the cross-launch panels in the Helix portal. You'll probably leave, so depending on what you selected in the products bit further up, here we go in the product section here, the smart apps. Depending which options you selected here, you should select the same here. So if you haven't installed Insights, uncheck that one. When this runs, it will add the cross-launch links to the Helix portal. The final section, Splunk is not relevant for on-prem today, so ignore all of this. And then the health check tool is, you probably won't have that out of the box. Well, you definitely won't have it out of the box. There are some optional steps that are explained in one of the knowledge base articles that's linked in the references, how to add this. But this allows you to use the health check tool to validate many of the parameters that you've just entered. When you select this option, when you build the pipeline, instead of actually starting the deployment, it writes all of the values out to a file on the file system, which you can then use to input to the health check tool as a validation. You have to remember then when you rebuild to uncheck that, otherwise the pipeline never does anything. It just continually rewrites the file. But there's a knowledge article that explains how to edit the Jenkins pipeline file to add this option. So once you've entered all of this information, you're ready to go. Click on the build option and the deployment will start. It will take between probably 2 and 4 hours, depending on the speed of your system and the options that you selected. You'll be able to monitor the pipeline progress by looking at the console output. So for example, when it reaches the Helix platform stage, let's imagine this one was actually in use, you can have a look at the console output and you'll see the various stages scrolling past as it's working. You will find that it sits for extended period, minutes at a time sometimes, whilst it's actually doing deployments. When that happens, maybe go to the command line on the deployment engine and use things like kubectl get pods to see what's going on in the namespace, or kubectl logs for different pods to try and understand what's going on. Some references to some of the articles that I mentioned. So the health check tool, for example, there's an overview there of the architecture as well, written by one of my colleagues, which is very useful. And then some of the product links, obviously, that we've been looking at today to help you get going. Right, thank you very much. Hopefully now we have time for some questions.